Welcome to the debate. So today we're tackling a really troubling subject, the spectacular collapse of the 2025 Washington Accords between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. This was a huge international effort, and yet the source material gives this really sobering diagnosis, that the accords were structurally predisposed to fail.
Right, and that analysis really forces us to look past the usual, hand-wringing about geopolitics and instead focus on the specific design failures. The text identifies several critical flaws, everything from exclusion and poor sequencing to weak enforcement and just perverse incentives.
And that really gets to our central question today. Which of those flaws was the most determinative? I'm going to argue that the fatal error was actually in the fundamental political structure, the initial misreading of power dynamics, and, critically, the exclusion of key armed actors from the negotiating table. I think that failure is what inverted the incentives for peace.
And I'll be taking the counterposition. While, look, exclusion was clearly a mistake, I'm going to maintain that the core failure was ultimately technical. The accords were doomed by flaws in sequencing logic and a completely inadequate enforcement architecture that basically rendered all the high-level commitments meaningless the moment they faced any real friction.
Okay, I see why you'd emphasize the technical mechanisms, I really do. But let me offer a different lens here, one that's a bit more grounded in the political reality of the situation. The Accords' failure was, I believe, primarily rooted in the exclusion of consequential actors. In mediation, we talk about confusing diplomatic consent, which is getting signatures from presidents, with conflict consent, which is getting genuine buy-in from the people who actually control violence on the ground.
That's a critical distinction, yeah. And it's one that mediators are constantly struggling with. How do you bring spoilers into the tent without, rewarding violence?
Exactly. But the way they handled it here was, frankly, catastrophic. The failure to include M23, which was, arguably the most consequential armed actor shaping territorial control in North and South Kivu at that time, it relegated them to a sideline. The Accords treated them as a proxy problem to be solved indirectly through pressure on Rwanda, rather than as an independent political force demanding direct engagement. And this flawed political diagnosis completely inverted their incentives.
And the result was pretty much an immediate escalation.
It was. The capture of Uvira by M23 right after the accords were signed wasn't irrational behavior. The source material rightly identifies it as strategically coherent. Uvira is a key port on Lake Tanganyika. It controls vital trade routes, border access. By seizing it, M23 transformed themselves from an omitted variable that diplomats were trying to ignore into an unavoidable stakeholder. Exclusion, especially of actors holding key strategic terrain and revenue streams, it creates an absolute incentive for violence. That fundamental political failure meant the document was irrelevant to the realities on the battlefield from day one.
That's a strong argument, and it's rooted in a kind of classic political realism. But I would frame the timing and the scope of the failure in a slightly different way. While the exclusion of M23 guaranteed a strong external spoiler, I maintain the accord was internally doomed by its technical implementation architecture, specifically the use of what we call asymmetric conditionality.
Okay, so let's define that for a moment because it's a pretty specialized term. What exactly do you mean by asymmetric conditionality in this context?
It just means the obligations placed on the two parties were fundamentally unequal in how easy they were to verify and how long they would take to fulfill. Look at the framework. It tied Rwanda's obligation of visible, discrete, and time-bound action like troop withdrawal to the DRC's obligation, which was diffuse, long-term, and inherently contestable.
And you're referring specifically to the clause requiring the neutralization of hostile militias in the DRC, especially the FDLR.
Exactly. And for our listeners who might not be steeped in the history of Eastern DRC, neutralizing the FDLR is, it's an internal security and counterinsurgency task for the Congolese state. It's a massive, decades-long project. It involves policing, military operations, demobilization. You can count when a Rwandan battalion leaves the border. You cannot easily verify when the FDLR, a decentralized and fluid group, has been entirely neutralized.
The timelines just don't match up.
Not at all. And this technical imbalance guaranteed deadlock from the very beginning. Experienced mediators always insist that conditional reciprocity has to be symmetrical in verifiability and in its time horizon. The moment you mismatch a clear withdrawal timeline with a vague, long-term security process, you have created a structural escape hatch. Asymmetry becomes a veto disguised as cooperation. It allows one party, usually the stronger, more capable one, to indefinitely claim non-compliance, thereby justifying their own refusal to act. So this technical flaw created an internal instability that no amount of political good faith could ever overcome.
I'm not convinced, though, that the sequencing was the ultimate fault line, because technical flaws like that only really matter if there is some fundamental buy-in to the process itself. The exclusion of M23 created the primary actor that was immediately incentivized to escalate.
But what if they had been at the table?
Well, if M23 had been offered some kind of conditional legitimacy, maybe a staged political track dependent on their restraint, the sequencing, even if it was flawed, might have been manageable. The political mistake dictated the immediate operational collapse. The Uvira seizure forced the entire diplomatic world to deal with the political fallout before the technical coordination mechanisms could even, get started. It was the political decision to sideline real power that made the structural failure materialize so quickly.
See, I come at it from a different way. I think the Uvira seizure merely exposed the structural flaw in the sequencing logic. It wasn't the flaw itself. Even if M23 had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, the accord still allowed Rwanda to claim perpetual noncompliance because of that FDLR neutralization clause. So the whole process had no internal stability, regardless of spoilers. It was structurally designed to collapse because it lacked that disciplined sequencing, where obligations were matched in scope and verifiability. M23 was the external pressure, sure, but the technical asymmetry was the weak joint that just cracked.
But let's look at that cracking point, the enforcement. You mentioned the inadequacy of the technical mechanisms, and I absolutely agree the Joint Security Coordination Mechanism, the JSCM, was a total failure.
A complete failure. And the failure of the JCM demonstrates the primacy of these technical design flaws. The mechanism was based on information sharing and good faith between parties that fundamentally distrust one another. I mean, think about it. You're asking two long-term adversaries to collaboratively monitor each other's compliance.
It's just a recipe for finger-pointing.
Precisely. The material notes very clearly that monitoring without enforcement is theater. And we saw no genuinely independent verification regime, no UN-mandated or technologically robust system with automatic consequences built into the accords. So when the fighting resumed, violations just became matters of narrative rather than fact, because there was no independent arbiter in power to just say, stop, you violated Clause 4, and now consequences A, B, and C are triggered automatically.
That's a compelling argument about the technical architecture it is. But have you considered how the economic pillar played into this lack of enforcement? Because an enforcement architecture is entirely irrelevant if the core incentives are so profoundly misaligned that the actors actually prefer war to peace.
The framework offered long-term economic integration, right? The whole idea of a shared pathway to prosperity. Focused on the critical minerals sector, it was supposed to anchor the peace.
In theory, yes. But in practice, the agreement offered that long-term economic integration while demanding immediate high-risk security concessions. And this is where the political and, frankly, the behavioral failure lies. We know from the source material that armed commanders and local actors, they don't make decisions based on 5-year investment horizons in, lithium exports.
Their concerns are immediate. Protection, revenue, control.
Exactly. They act based on immediate incentives. Control this territory, secure local revenue through taxation today, and ensure the survival of their armed group. By promising future economic gains while demanding immediate security concessions, like giving up territory or disarming, the accord just inverted the logic of incentive-based mediation. They didn't make peace profitable today, and this failure proves that long-term development incentives cannot substitute for short-term security and political guarantees. The incentive structure was just fundamentally inverted from a political standpoint.
But I think you're conflating the failure of incentives with a failure of enforcement. The incentives might have been weak, I'll grant you that, but a hardened technical enforcement structure, one with real teeth, could have forced compliance regardless of the immediate economic calculus of local commanders. If the Accords had stated that violating a troop withdrawal line automatically triggered sanctions on shared border trade, that automatic consequence, which is a technical design choice, changes the incentive structure overnight. The lack of that independent mechanism is the technical flaw that made compliance optional.
But if the armed groups were already excluded and felt they had absolutely nothing to gain from the Accords, which they didn't, then no level of technical enforcement on the two state parties could have restrained the violence M23 chose to unleash. The violence was external to the enforcement mechanism itself. And that brings us right back to the initial political error of exclusion. And furthermore, we have to look at how the political design failed downward too. It wasn't just about M23. The Accords marginalized local communities, customary authorities, Congolese civil society.
You're pointing to the fact that this was essentially an elite pact. That's a common criticism of these kinds of high-level agreements.
It is, but in this volatile context, the consequences were severe. Think of it like a business merger where the CEOs sign off, but the people who actually run the factory floor aren't even in the building. That's what happened. The pact was negotiated far from the conflict zone, and critically, there were no immediate protection dividends front-loaded into the agreement for civilians.
Protection dividends, you mean immediate, verifiable security improvements for the people suffering the most.
Precisely. Without that, communities rapidly lose confidence in the process. When the fighting inevitably resumed, the mass displacement and civilian deaths just validated the skepticism of everyone who had been excluded, from M23 all the way down to the village chiefs. If the political design doesn't secure local legitimacy by visibly and immediately improving security, it just accelerates the irrelevance of the entire document. This is a profound political failure of inclusion, not just of armed groups, but of the very population the process was supposed to serve.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the failure of local legitimacy, while obviously crucial for long-term reconciliation, was the proximate cause of the Accords' collapse. I mean, the elite pact design is often necessary just to get the presidential signatures you need to move to implementation.
And what happens when that implementation fails?
It fails because the internal framework is weak. It was the failure of sequencing and enforcement that allowed hostilities to resume and inflict that mass displacement and those civilian deaths. A robust, symmetrical technical design, one that couldn't be so easily circumvented by claiming endless FDLR noncompliance, would have created verifiable security guarantees. That technical stability would have been the best and most immediate form of civilian protection, by showing that the peace process had teeth and preventing the escalation in the first place. The process collapsed due to a lack of disciplined process, not a lack of community representation at the signing.
But process without power mapping is just an intellectual exercise. If you fail to include the actors who control violence, and you fail to incentivize the population to support the peace, then the technical architecture, however brilliant, is built on quicksand. The political foundation has to be sound first.
And I see the technical design as that foundational concrete. If that concrete is flawed, if the conditionality is asymmetric and the enforcement is powerless, then even the political actors who do sign have an easy diplomatic escape hatch the moment pressure mounts. The asymmetry was the structural weakness that allowed the deal to be abandoned without any meaningful international consequence. The failure lies in the mechanics that let them cheat the system.
I think we can certainly agree that the Washington Accords were a profound failure of design across multiple vectors. Both the political and the technical dimensions were just deeply flawed.
Absolutely. It's a textbook case of how multiple weaknesses can interact under stress.
However, my position remains that the ultimate collapse resulted from a flawed political diagnosis. By failing that functional requirement of inclusion, that is, failing to engage actors with the capacity to spoil through structured political pathways, the mediators ensured that the agreement had no real bearing on the balance of power on the battlefield. The core lesson here, for me, is the functional necessity of redefining inclusion and correctly reading political power dynamics before you even start drafting terms.
And while defining power is necessary, this outcome demonstrates that poor technical design is fundamentally fatal to a peace process, even when the political will is temporarily there.
The reliance on asymmetric conditionality and the lack of an independent, empowered monitoring mechanism. It just created a system that was unusable under the first signs of stress. For me, the failure reinforces the need for mediators to have harder standards on discipline sequencing, matching obligations in time, and verifiability, and ensuring enforcement is insulated from diplomatic discretion. The framework was just inherently unstable, regardless of who was invited to the ceremony.
Both of our perspectives, I think, illuminate critical design failures in the Washington Accords. And understanding these competing explanations, whether the failure was fundamentally political due to exclusion or fundamentally technical due to asymmetric sequencing, is really essential for advancing mediation practice in conflicts like this one.
Yeah. And there is certainly more to explore in the material about how those two types of failures interact under the stress test of resumed fighting and how that informs what we should do next time.